So this is going to be fairly basic. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. I've just got this little GIF that is kind of like re-looping. And I'll play it a couple times so you guys can see it. So this is an entirely just off of one path shape. I want to get into sort of looking at the path shape. This is like, I don't know, like a Spider-Man transition or something. It's supposed to look kind of like webbish, but it's just one shape that you add points to, and then you animate the path points. And I want to take a look at this as just a very simplified breakdown of what we're going to try and do first. Once we're done with this kind of simplified demonstration of this process, we'll get into something that's a little bit more fun. We can make it into a logo reveal process, and then we'll get into some fun things that we can do, additional things that you can add to shape layers as we're going through. So I'm just going to play this a couple times. You guys can see there's quite a lot of points in there. It is step by step, so it's not going to be like an explosion of way too much information, I don't think. But of course, please feel free to ask questions as we're going along. Okay, felt like we saw that. You guys ready to get started? Emoji if you can hear me. Cool, thanks. All right, so I'm going to close this one out and we'll jump into After Effects. All righty. So this is the document that I have so far. And if I close these in the correct order, you should see basically the same thing. And it's all really kind of animated with paths. Now, I don't want to scare you or anything. There's quite a few paths in here, and it's sort of all animated just under the path section. And as you can tell, if I click on the object, you see how many paths are on there. Don't worry, you kind of add them as you go and kind of animate them as you need them. So it's not terribly complicated. It's not start this complicated. You just start with 4 points. So the tools that we're going to be using, and I have a couple of resources for you for hotkeys that I want to share as well. Let me pull up that page so that you can see what I'm talking about. There are some awesome hotkey solutions on the motion graph, or excuse me, the School of Motion website. So I'll share this link with you, and I'll put this in the chat real quick as well as onto our Microsoft Teams channel in case this is something you want. But I'm going to ask you guys to try and start working with shortcuts because you know, hotkeys are shortcuts. Is a really useful set of things, right? So we know that we went over like A, P, S, R, and T for like the standard transitions. Being able to open up things that you're animating. I think if you hit U on your keyboard, it's going to give you kind of like all of the stuff that you are animating and sort of simplify your view of just the things that the stopwatches have started. If you hit W, UU, I think, where is it? Down here somewhere, there it is. It'll open up a layers, all of the properties on a layer. So those are some useful hotkeys that I would suggest using. A couple other hotkeys that we're going to use is V on our keyboard, which is going to be the selection tool, and then G, which is actually the pen tool hotkey. And I'll try to go over as many of those hotkeys or shortcuts as we get into within this. So I think just let's start a new composition. So if you want to go up to, if you've opened up After Effects and done nothing else, you should be able to do new. And in fact, I will go to composition and close this project. File, close project. Don't need to save it because it's already saved. So when you're starting a new composition, you can go to File or New, or you can click this button. This will just give us a new kind of like window to be able to go into this. So we're going to start filling in the information here. Let's just do maybe 10 seconds. We probably don't need more than that. I think a good rule of thumb to do with this when you're setting up a new composition is give yourself one extra frame than you think you need for your time. The reason being, I'll show you this here in a second, is you cannot slide your timeline slider onto the last frame of a composition. It needs to have space for it to actually be able to connect there. So if you limit it to 10 and then one frame, right? So this is 10 seconds and 1 frame. This will give you a little bit more control over your sort of composition that you're working with. All right, so I think that's a good idea. I just put it at 1080 by 1080, so standard sort of square size. I think 30 pixels, or yeah, 30 frames per second, I think will be fine if you want to set it to something like that. The 30 frames per second, the reason that number is used is because that is typically the frame rate that the human eye can pick up. So we kind of view life in about 30 frames a second. When you have like video games and stuff that are like 60 frames a second, you like see more frames per second, kind of, a little bit. All right, so this is our composition settings. That's all we really need to do to get started. I'm then going to switch over to my other document, but essentially you should have the exact same document set up. And again, the reason I'm switching to my other document is just to sort of have the layers that I've already animated to remind myself of the things that I wanted to show you. But we'll all start fresh. I'll just turn the layers off and we'll all start fresh that way. So just to let you know what's going on there. Let me go ahead and close this project and I'll open up the previous one. All right. Turn these off. And we're going to go inside one of these. Okay, so everything's turned off. You can just ignore my other layers that are here. The thing that we're going to do first is to add in a shape layer. So there's a couple different ways that you could do this. And kind of the first way that we do this, you could go to your rectangle tool and select your ellipse. Hotkey for that one looks like it's Q. And you could just sort of click and drag to create a shape. So that is one standard way to sort of make a shape. The problem is we don't know if this is going to be in the center of our composition. We kind of want to start from the center. So there's a different way that we could do this, and I'm going to undo that. But that is just one way to do it. Just know that you can just use the shape layer as long as that is set to sort of like included in a new shape. That'll be a new shape. You have no layers selected. It's not going to add it as a mask. Another way to do this is you can go to the layer menu at the top and choose new shape layer. So there's not a hotkey for that one, but this is what we're going to be playing around with today. So again, that's the layer menu, new and shape layer. You should see nothing on your screen when you do that. And we're going to talk about the reason why. If I kind of twirl down this little contents, of course, you're used to seeing the transform things. We're going to kind of ignore some of the transform properties until maybe later on. But we want to start adding in contents into our shape layer. We can also give it a name here. We'll do that here in a second. But you guys see this little button right here that says add. And again, I'm sorry, I can't zoom into my screen, but just throw me an emoji if you can see the add button real quick, if you are there with me at this point. Okay, good deal. All right. And please feel free to interrupt me if I go a little bit too fast. Under the add button, when I click that little arrow, and I do want you to see this because there's a couple different other things that we'll use. So when we do certain text animations, the text animator, when you add in type tool or a type layer, there's also a lot of different options of things that you can add in a similar placement for the different ways that you can animate the text. So I do want you to guys see this. A lot of the properties that we change are less on the screen than maybe you're used to in like an Illustrator or Photoshop, and a lot more with the layer itself. So when you're looking at the add, what you can do is add an ellipse. And I do want you to click the button to add an ellipse. Now, this is a little bit confusing, so just hang with me for a second. Go ahead and click the add button and then choose ellipse from that option. It should give us all a standard sized ellipse. You should be able to see that it actually does not have the color or fill or stroke information that it should at the top of the screen. So you guys see here some information at kind of our toolbar. If you look at the top of your screen next to your tools, your toolbar, we're going to call this the toolbar at the top of your screen. It's actually underneath kind of the information where it says, you know, Adobe After Effects 2020. It says like desktop and demonstrations, you know, whatever the file name is. Underneath that, you should see that there's two different boxes here. One of them is going to sort of show that the tool is creating a shape and not a mask. And then I have fill, right now mine is set to purple, and a stroke, which is also set to sort of like a darker purple, and it should be 14 pixels. But if you can tell, there is no fill or stroke information on this particular object. We've created what's called an ellipse path. And you should see that it doesn't say ellipse, it says ellipse path. And just to show the difference there and the reason why this is happening, and just so it's not confusing moving forward, you don't have to do this, but just to follow along with me, I'm clicking and dragging. When I click and drag, it adds what's called an ellipse and not an ellipse path. And as you can tell, you can actually have multiple shapes within the same shape layer, which is actually a really amazing feature. Now, when you add it this way, it does add in the stroke and the fill information. When you add it in this way with the add button, you actually have to go through the process of also adding the information of what you would like it to be filled with from that same add menu. The reason they do that is it could be potentially that you want to use the shape layer as a mask, and therefore you don't want it to necessarily have a fill or a stroke, or one or the other. You could then also fine tune exactly what you want it to do within that space. And as you can tell, these are kind of divided in different sections, right? You can add a group, which would be empty. This will help you organize your layers. You could add in the next section, there's a little gray line here. You can add in different kinds of shapes. It could just be a path that you draw, a polystar, which is a great way to make stars and triangles, an ellipse or a rectangle, which I think makes sense there. The next section is the things that you can add to the particular contents of that shape, that particular object that we just added, which is the ellipse path number 1, also divided within those gray lines. And then all of these things down here are different things that we can make it animate with. So lots of opportunities to play around with stuff. We'll take a look at some of these later on in the demo. So for now, we just want to add a fill to this. So go ahead and add a fill. Now I don't want like a red color. I think that's a little bit too bright. Kind of like these soft purples or something within that darker background. So choose whatever color you like within the fill. But as you can tell, I went to the add button. I went in and added a fill, and then it added a whole nother layer underneath my path my ellipse path number 1, and that fill is now populating that particular object. So just the way that you add these things, be conscious about the way that you add them. This gives you the most control to go through the add layer because you get to add something to the very center of the composition, and then very fine-tunedly, kind of process-wise, add in these different informations from there. Okay, so we've added in a fill. If you twirl down the fill, you should see that there's an opportunity here. And I'm just going to scroll this up a little bit so we can see my layers a little bit more clearly. You should see that there's an option where you can actually animate the color. And just to try this, we don't need to be animating the color right at this point, but just as an opportunity, if you want to go ahead and click that stopwatch so you can see how the color transitions, this is something that animates with a traditional keyframe. So it's not one of those like stop hold keyframes. It doesn't just automatically switch to color like it did with the gradient demo that we did on Monday. This is an opportunity where you can actually shift things along the color wheel. So if you think about the color wheel for a second, it goes around, right? And so there's a shift between things. So if we change the color from one side to the other, it's going to shift through all the colors that it goes through to get to that. And so as you can see, when I've added that in, it will shift from kind of purple to yellow, which is kind of fun. So you can animate all of these things. This is just one thing that you can animate underneath the fill option. Opacity is also there. You don't need to do this, but just to sort of demonstrate that process, you can see that that color is very slowly transitioning between the two. Now, one of the nice features of being able to animate, I'm going to turn this off, by the way, I don't want to animate color at the moment. One of the nice features of animating with shape layers is that they don't take up a lot of space in your document. So as far as like file size mitigation, it is a nice feature to be able to work with shape layers and sort of animate those because they're not very like, heavy in the sense, it's not a linked file to an Illustrator document that has lots of like detail and shapes and layers all composed into one layer that you then animate together. This is just a single layer that's got one shape on it. So it starts off at about the smallest file size that you can have for a video. I'm going to close down this file 1 and open up the ellipse path number 1. Now this is something that we want to animate, but we actually want to animate it a little bit different way. We want to animate the Bezier path. So if you can tell, when I right click on the ellipse path, we want to convert this to a Bezier path. And I've opened this, I've twirled this open, right? I've hit this little down arrow right next to ellipse path. So you can see that the two things that you can animate so far are only size and position. You do not see a path option there. And that is something that we want to get from this. So if say size and position, size is just scale. You can tell, those are the things that you can animate. You guys are used to seeing those things like X and Y. You guys are used to seeing that stuff. Now, this isn't what we want to animate when we animate the path. So again, I'm going to right click on the ellipse path 1 that's within the shape layer and choose convert to Bezier path. And now it should have changed to something else. The layer is now a little bit different. It is now a path. It's now changed from ellipse to path 1. And the only option now that I have to animate within this is now just path. So this is actually the feature that we want to animate. And I'm just going to zoom in on this layer so that you can see it a little bit more clearly. I'm just using my zoom tool, which is Z on the keyboard, and just clicking a couple times to zoom in. As you can tell, there's only 4 points on this path so far. In the example that I showed you a little bit ago, there's lots of paths, and we can add this to it. And I always get messed up because I'm so used to hitting P on the keyboard to go to the pen tool. The pen tool hotkey is not P anymore, it is G. So if you want to try hitting the G button on your keyboard to be able to select the pen tool. And again, I had the shape layer selected, and I also clicked on path 1 and the path feature. Now, every time you add or subtract a point from this, I believe it just exists for the entirety of the timeline. So if I go in over here and sort of add a point at like 4 seconds, or it's still going to add in a point everywhere. So if I add a point there, just hovering over the line to add in that point, it exists there everywhere now. So this is a little bit of a limitation when you're animating with paths. Again, the advantage is it's going to be a smaller file size. You can animate all these things over time. You can completely deform or redraw any object through the Bezier sort of pen system. So if you're familiar with pen tool in Illustrator or Photoshop, it's going to be very similar. I don't want to leave anyone behind, so if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of go over some of the process of how this works. Not intending to try and go too slow or anything, but just I think as a process to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page, I'll go ahead and just kind of talk about what this system and how it works. So as you can tell, before I added that point, you can switch between your V key, which is your selection tool, and just click on any one of these points to be able to edit them. And I did that in a couple different ways, right? I actually selected the path, If it's not allowing me to sort of click on the individual point, right, I'm just using my selection tool to click on the point, but it's not selecting the point. You can tell it's not selected because they're all just kind of that darker blue color that's filled in there. And also, if you don't like the color, by the way, you can click on this color and change it to something else. So as you can tell, when I'm selecting the layer, if I select the path, it's going to select all the paths. I want to be able to select just one, in which case what I need to do is actually click off of the shape once, which will then select the parent layer, the sort of the top level layer of the grouped contents, which is shape layer 2 in this case. Yours might be shape layer 1. And then just click on the point. And now you can see that I have those handlebars. So let me just talk about how this shape works. I'm going to move it around. So just follow along with me for a minute. And again, I'm just trying to do a little explanation of how the pen tool and Bezier paths work. So this shape is bent depending on the shape of these points. There are 4 points. They're all the same size and same shape because it is a concentric circle. These handlebars bend the line that they're connected to. So if you can tell, there's one handlebar right here and one handlebar right here at the point in the top. So there's 2 points to be able to create this curve between the 2 points. So just like any line is just a shape between 2 points, or a drawing between two points, this is then a shape that you can manipulate and change because of the outside edge or the line that's been drawn there. This little Bezier curve, this anchor point can be able to, handlebar can kind of rechange the shape of that shape there by just clicking and dragging on the handlebar. So 3 different things that you can click on for each individual point. You can click on the individual point itself by clicking and dragging and moving that around. You can click on the handlebars by clicking and dragging on those. You can tell that just deforms the shape by pulling the line in a different direction, depending on where you pull it to. There are 2 of these handlebars that are interacting with this particular line because it is a curved line, and the length of the handlebars, how close they are to the point that they come out from, or the direction that they go in will change the shape. And this is kind of what we're talking about when we're looking at being able to make things look fluid or within motion. If you can tell when I animate this, this is going to really look like kind of just like a wiggly liquid, right? So there's a lot of opportunity to be able to create these very fluidic kind of shapes as we're animating within this space. So I'm just trying to break down how this functions. If you're familiar with Bezier paths in Illustrator, Photoshop, they are exactly the same thing. It takes a little step-by-step process to sort of drill down to be able to select them. And I will redo that here in a second, but just wanted to try and explain how this works. I can sort of click on different shapes. It'll let me here to be able to interact with them in a different way. I can click down to select the path. I want to make sure I have my selection tool selected, right? So that's my V key. The hotkey for that one is select that tool, just the little arrow. I'm going to go ahead and just click off of the shape once. Or in this case, I can actually just click on the shape layer. Maybe that would be an easier way to do it. Just click on the shape layer, the top level path, just the whole layer itself, not on the path, just the shape layer. And then you should be able to click on one of the points to edit, to move it. Sorry, I think my Wacom pen is messing up. There we go. There we go. Yes, okay, awesome. Thank you. Saw the thumbs up there. Sorry about that. I wasn't trying to complicate it up, but yeah, just click on the shape layer, not on the path. That might be the easier sort of step-by-step process. Then just click on one of the points that you want to move. And it's a little bit confusing to get into that kind of routine. Some of these are very specific within the processes that we have to kind of do to be able to manipulate it. But as you can tell, you can kind of move these around. And of course, you can always Command Z and go backwards if you want to sort of reset it back into its original shape. Yeah, excellent question. So let's click on the shape layer and then click on the point to move it around. All right, so now let's switch to our pen tool, which is G. And we want to add in a point at about sort of the intersections that would be, halfway between each of the points. So if you just want to follow along with me first, we'll go through this and then we'll kind of start animating some of these things. So you can add points anytime. You can add points anytime after you start animating. You can add it later on in the composition, and they'll just still reform to themselves as it goes back in time. And I'll show that here in a second. But as you can tell, when I hover over my pen tool, and if I go along the edge of the line, do you see there's a star little symbol that's next to the pen tool? When I hover next to the line, it turns into a little plus sign. If I hover over one of the points, it'll allow me to also move it around. So there's some functionality with different hotkeys that we can hit within the pen tool. And the pen tool allows us to do a lot of animating with just the one tool selected, which is really nice. So again, we just want to add in some points. I'll do that first. I'll go in and just hover over the line here, and then click till I get to about halfway between these 2 points, just on the left-hand top side over there. I'll do the same thing over here. Click and add a point about halfway. It's okay if it's not perfect, doesn't matter. Just see if you can add in 4 points there. So you should see now instead of 4 points, we have 8 in total. So the pen tool is a very, very useful tool to be able to manipulate these things. I do want to show you a couple of the hotkeys that you can press and hold down to be able to manipulate this in a different way. And then we'll go ahead and move on and start animating. So as you can tell, when I have the, again, hotkey is G for the pen tool. To be able to select this shape, I can now click and drag on any of the points, which is very handy. I can click and drag on the handlebars to manipulate the shape. So if I wanted it to kind of bubble in this direction, I can click and drag and kind of pull these around. Now it's got this cool, like, kind of liquid shape that started with a circle, right? I mean, that's kind of fun. So it might, I don't know, maybe a little water droplet or flame ball or something. So that'd be kind of fun to manipulate in that sense. I can also hold down the command button, which will allow me to manipulate a couple different things differently. So again, as I'm still hovering over not the edge, not the line of this particular shape, this like outer red line, as opposed to the purple, it's going to add in another shape. I'm just holding down the command button the whole time. I can also hover over any of these points and subtract them. So as you can tell, I can like get rid of those points if I wanted to. It does deform the shape a little bit when you do that. So go back before I did that. I can also hold the command button and hover over any of the handlebars or the line in between to be able to manipulate these handlebars. Do you see now that these handlebars are broken? They're kind of going in different directions. This is a feature that is pretty standard for kind of this tool. You can have these kind of more bunny ears, like kind of the bunny ear shape to the handlebar. And let me show you what that means. I'll go back before I did that. So as you can tell, when I move the handlebar normally, see how the other one on the opposite side that I'm not moving reacts to the direction that this one is moving into. So it sort of continues the same line along through that point. If for some reason you wanted things to be a little bit more angular, right, instead of rounded, you can hold down the command button and then pull on those handlebars to sort of get them to come to an angle or a point. This is what's called sort of breaking the handlebars because they're not connected anymore. And so that's kind of one of the features within that. But let's go ahead and jump in and start animating this stuff so we're not just like me gabbing all day. So I'm going to zoom back out. What I want to be able to do is sort of add in some anticipation. And just to preview again what we're planning on doing with this kind of like Spider-Man transition, we want to be able to start with a circle and then have it start to reach to one side before it shoots out and starts to kind of cling to the wall or just sort of outside the composition. So let's start with just that motion first, and then we'll play around with how we can add some more points to these. Okay, so I'm going to go down into the path. We do want to animate the path, so I'm going to go ahead and click the stopwatch that's next to the path there to start animating. Let's move forward in our timeline to about 1 second or so. And we will then zoom in so that we can see what we're working on here. Oops. This will be perfect. All right, so we want to add another keyframe here, or we don't have to click the keyframe button. You certainly can to add a keyframe, but because we've moved to a different timestamp in our composition, we can actually just start animating this. So I'm going to switch to my pen tool again. I'll just click and drag on one of these handles over to the side to sort of start stretching it out a little bit. And maybe we'll move a couple of these so that they kind of feels like it's reaching out like a little, I don't know, slime arm or something. Awesome. So when you play this back and forth, as you can tell, this animates very easily. This is not a very difficult thing for After Effects to be able to do systematically, and it just moves that path. So as we've moved this path from one spot to the other, we're just kind of animating along the path. And this is a really nice feature. Again, we're only animating one property, just the path property. And again, if you didn't remember, guys, we did have to right click and choose convert to Bezier path for us to get that property. Make sure that you see that path property or this will not work correctly. But you can animate this path, which means you can add as many points to this at any time. You can animate it along a direction that you're going in, and then you can make it seem like it is a little bit more of kind of a rotoscoped looking thing, right? Because we're adding motion to one particular tiny object. It's not the same kind of thing that we were doing with our previous project where you're animating, a layer from Illustrator that is sort of set in place, right? And then you can add in the transformations. And again, those transformations are still available to us. This is something that we can animate the entire thing all at once to change their anchor point or position or scale or rotation or opacity, but we're also animating the path. And this is the thing that's very common with After Effects. We're compounding our skills. We're like adding to them. It's not that we're forgetting about transformation entirely. We can still animate all of this at the same time. We're just also adding another feature to this of path that we can animate, which is very exciting. And we'll compound these as we continue. So I'm going to go ahead and go to then the second, right? So second number 2. And we want to be able to get this to shoot all the way across the screen. So I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to hit my Z key and then hold down the Option key to be able to, or Alt key to be able to get that to turn into a minus. And then each time I click, it'll zoom out. You can also do it from here, like the zoom levels, if that's how you prefer. That's totally fine. I think you can also do like plus and minus or something, maybe, or control plus and minus. I can't remember. But there's a couple different ways to zoom out. And what we want to do with this now is just to get this to zoom across the screen, right? So we're going to pull it a really long ways all the way until it's completely off the composition. And again, I advanced it in my timeline. You do always have to advance in your timeline to be able to get something to animate. And all we're doing in here is we're still applying the same principles that we had before, right? So this we're applying is sort of this anticipation motion that we're going through to be able to then say, this is a part that's going to move, pay attention right here, and then zoom, something happens. Right? So it's something that's kind of like setting up with the motion and then zooming in. And that's a principle that we'll apply to everything that we do. I'm going to go ahead and zoom back in here. And I'm just going to select my pen tool again and kind of pull on some of these handlebars to give it just a little bit more of like this kind of string look as I thin it out in the angles there. And again, it will remember all this and sort of just change them within that time frame. So as we're working on this, I can tell that this is just a little bit too slow for me. And honestly, I'm probably going to need to speed this up. And we may need to do some adjustments later on as well. But let's go ahead and move this backwards. So I'm going to grab my third keyframe and just click and drag on that in my layer to be able to speed this up. And I made it maybe like half of a second instead of a single second. And that's still a little bit too slow for me. So I may shrink this down a little bit even more. There we go. That looks a little bit cooler. And we can add easy ease to these in a little bit. So we'll play around with these later on. But let's go ahead and just put this at, what is this? I don't know, 1 second, 10 frames or something, if you want to like follow along exactly. That seems like a decent amount of time. And we'll mess with these a little bit later. So we're going to continue this, right? So like we're going to have this kind of like explosion of these kind of like, I don't know, string pieces from the same object. And again, just to kind of share with you what we were thinking about doing, this is kind of the form that we're including in this. It'll add in this kind of like, I can only describe it with sound effects, sorry, to kind of get these to stand out, right? So we've added in a couple points to this already so that some of those points can sort of stay as the sort of circle shape. And then we'll go ahead and add in some more of these. So let's go to about 5 frames later, and let's have another one of these to start move. So I'll zoom in here. And select my pen tool one more time, select the layer, and let's get like this bottom one to start anticipating some movement. And maybe let's do the one over here as well in the corner. So I'm just kind of picking maybe, let's do every other one of these to kind of get it to zoom out here. Starting to stretch there. And then we'll advance maybe another 5 frames or 10 frames. And we'll get these to zoom to the location off screen. Switch to my G key, and I'll click and drag on these to zoom down here. Maybe let's be a little bit more random with it, maybe. About which direction they go. All right, let's try this a little bit faster now. We'll see if we can speed this up. So what I'm going to do is try to adjust some of these as my keyframes go and sort of like thin them out in some places. So I will zoom in here to my paths. and adjust the handlebars a little bit to sort of pull on this object here. So you can sort of thin this out in some places. You can hold on the space bar if you need to move yourself around the screen. That looks more goopy, I guess. Slime creature. So it is stretching, and then I will add this to the top level one as well. Add some anticipation, advance it a little bit, and then have that zoom across the screen.
Hey, Josh, quick question.
So,
how did you get to where you could pull just the one handle instead of both of them?
so it is both of them. Is this what you mean?
Yeah, but like you had them like where you can move them separate without it moving the other side.
Mm-hmm. So that is if you hold down the command button, and then you should see this kind of this like, I don't know, chevron, or I think it's called a caret symbol. And when you hold down the command button to be able to click on that, then you can, adjust just one side. So then you can add like little curves or something like that if you wanted.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question. All right, and then I will limit this to about 2 seconds, and I'll zoom out and let's see what this looks like. Got to make sound effects. Kind of goopy or whatever, right? Kind of shoots out. We can adjust timing and things later, but I think this is kind of doing what we're wanting it to do, right? It's kind of just sending out little, I don't know, slime tendrils or something. And again, please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. We're going to start adding some more points to this, right? So we want to kind of like expand this a little bit more so that we are getting something that's a little bit, more detail, right? We need to add in more of these kind of pieces that start bubbling out from this kind of slime creature in the center. So I'm going to go ahead and just where I'm at, I'm about 2 seconds now at this point. I'm going to zoom back in to my layer here. I'm going to switch to my pen tool, which I always hit P for some reason. So I need to untwirl this. You can actually hit U once to pull up just the path if you wanted. So if you want to ignore everything else in your layer, you can double hit U if you want to expand the whole thing, or just hit U once to be able to see just the path. I need to switch my G key, which is the pen tool, not P. And then I will go ahead and add in a couple points. So I'm going to put some points right next to on either side of the 4 that I still have in here. So I want some anchor placements within these, and I want some things to stay while some things move. So in this case, I've added, how many is that? 8 more points. And I'll do that again. So if you guys want to follow along with me, you can see where I'm putting them. I kind of have this, I don't know, goopy shape right now. I'm just going next to where the points are. You can sort of see where those red little dots are. And I'm going to go ahead and just click to the left and to the right along the line next to those points, which means we will then be ready to go ahead and move the ones that are in the middle, so that that part of it that's still kind of like goopy and stringy will stay where it is, and we can move these points in the middle. So this will be the next kind of piece that stars out from this goopy creature. Can we give this, let's give this one a name. Should we name them? If you go to your shape layer and then just hit the enter key, you can rename the layer. What's a good name? Any name ideas? I got two in the chat. Flubber, nice. Dave, can we do Dave Flubber? I like that. That's pretty fun. Good name choices. David Flubber. Thank you. That's very fun. All right. All right, very cool. All right, so we added a few points, and if you can tell, guys, as I'm backing this up, and if I'm hoping that everyone's okay with adding the points. If you're not quite finished with that, it's okay. Just come back to my screen and you can see. Do you guys see that those points now exist everywhere along the path right from the beginning, but that nothing was changed with the object? So right from the center, when we started with a perfect circle, there's now a bunch of points in there, but that's fine because we're not like, changing anything. It's just that they follow along the line how they would have, just exactly how they would have if there had not been a point there, but now that those points are included. So now those points exist all of the time, if that makes sense, all along the timeline is what I mean. So now I'm ready to go ahead and expand my workspace a little bit. I'll go back, up to maybe 4 seconds so I can see a little bit more time. And I'm going to advance again, maybe about half of a second, or like maybe 5 frames or 10 frames within that. I'm going to go ahead and start adding some anticipation within my points again to start adding more. And I may do this a little bit staggered, which I think would be fun. Or go in about 5 frames ahead, and I'll start 1. I'll go then 5 frames ahead again and start another one while I make the last one start stretching out. I can zoom out if I need to figure out how I want to put that in my composition. Switch to my G key to move this around, or V if that one was working better for you. I'll kind of pull on these handlebars a little bit to deform it. Now that's kind of misshaping some of the previous ones. So maybe I need to pull on the handlebars of the ones that are at the end. That is perfectly fine to sort of get this to stretch there. Kind of like the placement there. So as I'm adding anticipation to one, I'm adding stretch to another. So it kind of does this kind of motion along the series. I kind of like it down here. Let's make this one go over this way. Whoops, that was the one that I needed to anticipate. I'm going to go forward about 5 frames. Make the next one anticipate the motion. And then make this one shoot out. And then move forward 5 more frames. Anticipate the next one, while the last one that I had just added anticipation to 2 also shoots out. Not too bad. Is it starting to make sense kind of how this works? Let's go ahead and add some more points then. If you're feeling comfortable with this, you feel free to just kind of zoom ahead if that sounds comfortable. I'm basically going to be doing the same thing as this continues out, right? I'm going to add in some more points now from wherever I am so that I have some points that are going to stay and some points that will then be able to sort of continue doing this sort of stretching motion as it goes around the object. So I'm trying to create this sort of like cascading effect, which could be then potentially used for sort of like a transition between sort of a darker black background to maybe a purple background, which can sort of reveal things in that sense. So we're sort of adding a transition as sort of a practice piece to our path animations. I feel like it's okay to use sound effects. And this time, as I'm going out from the center, I'm actually extending the length of the circle from the center piece as it goes around. So I'm adding points kind of along the path. And if you want to look and see sort of what I'm doing with that, this is where I started, sort of going clockwise. So if you think about it from like 12 or 11:58 or whatever, but around the 12 kind of hour mark, I started closer to the point, and then the next one that would be maybe 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4, 5, 6 o'clock, I started expanding those away from sort of where the anchor point center would be, so that as this is extending out, it's starting to encompass more and more of the screen, right? We kind of want to have this like motion as it's coming toward the screen to fill it. So I'm making this a little bit longer as we go out from the center point. So if this is the center point and the points are kind of spiraling out from the center, we're kind of adding that just little spiral effect by making the points further distance from the ones that will be moving. And I don't even know how many points we added there. 17, it looks like. But you should feel a little bit more comfortable doing this at this point. Hopefully, feeling like it's making a little bit more sense. So you're kind of adding in those points there. So we'll add a little anticipation, move about 5 frames forward. add some anticipation on the next one, and then move the previous one that we added anticipation to. Quick little tip with this, guys, while you're working on this, if you want to just take a second and switch over to my screen just for a second, you can actually hold on to the handlebar and pull the handlebar with your tool at the same time as you move the point. And it's actually similar in Illustrator and Photoshop. If you click and drag while you're clicking and dragging and pulling on the handlebar, if I then also start holding down the space bar, I can then sort of lock the handlebar in place and move the point around. And then once I got the point where I like it, then I can let go of spacebar, still clicking and dragging the whole time, and then start pulling on the handlebar again. So it just gives you an opportunity to maybe work a little bit faster than having to let go of the handlebar, then move the point, then go back to the handlebar to be able to make adjustments. One more little quick tip, guys, if you want to switch your screen real fast. Sorry to keep interrupting you. Not meaning to do that, but just as you're adding in these things, this just sort of pops up a little bit. If you need to replace kind of the handlebars on a point at any time, if you hold down the command button, I believe it is, or no, I'm sorry, the option or alt key with the pen tool selected, it'll switch to this caret. You can, of course, then break the handlebars if you need to, but if you need to reconnect them, you can actually click and drag on the point to back add in those handlebars that are then connected. And you can also just single click instead of click and drag, and it'll just get rid of the handlebars altogether. So if you want to just like a straight edge from point to point, if you want the handlebars to be broken, if you want to then click and drag to reconnect them, that is all things that you can do by using the pen tool, holding down the option key. I'm going to go ahead and advance on mine. And I'll go ahead and play it just to see where I've gotten to at this point. As you're still working, if you don't mind, just take a break for a second. I'll kind of show you how to finish this up within this kind of transitional movement so we can move on to the next thing. So as you can see with mine, I'll go ahead and click play. I know maybe the frame rate and zoom isn't the best, but it just kind of slides out. Some of them are a little bit cascading. I may need to speed them up and start adding things to the different kind of keyframes as it goes through. I think it's a little bit too slow here. I want it to go a lot faster. So what I'm going to do is go back to some of my previous keyframes to start filling them and moving them a little bit faster all at once. I'm going to make sure that I'm on the next keyframe. And one quick little tip with this, if I go to my left and right arrow keys that are over here next to the path, and I believe there's a next keyframe, previous keyframe hotkey, if I were to look that up onto the onto our list of hotkeys that was from the Motion School of Motion, move between keyframes, it looks like J and K. Even between properties. So that may be something worth checking out. Let's see, J, yep, and K. So I can advance, go backwards with J, go forwards with K, which is actually very helpful. So I want to make sure that I'm on the keyframe itself when I'm adding in some of these things. So I want to speed up some of these motions by just making sure the more pieces are kind of filling the screen at a certain point, right? It's nice to have it go slow at the beginning, and then as it gets a little bit faster as it goes through, we want to make sure that it's kind of like kind of starting to fill the screen a little bit. So I'm going to start moving some of these original pieces that can also anticipate as their motion is including. So I'm going to back up a few of these, maybe about here, and start anticipating a few more of these pieces that are then going to kind of add in their motion. I'll have to move them since I backed up. This is one kind of not so great piece along this. Do you guys see this? When I go back and forth between these two keyframes, and again, I'm just hitting J and K to be able to slide back and forth. If they look like they're backing up, like sort of going backwards, it's because every time I add a keyframe and there's only one of these paths, this is just animating all on the same path. As I'm going forward and backwards, if there's any point where previously I had them in a different position, those points, I need to be able to move them forward. So I'm just going to go through and kind of add in some of these kind of motions. It's a little bit, keeping track of individual pieces as you go through, and then knowing, okay, I got to move these ones that are moving backwards now because I don't want them to move backwards, and go ahead and put them back into a place. And I'm just going to double check by going back and forth. Forward, forward. This one backs up here. And whenever they overlap each other, that's when it's just going to fill the screen. You can hold Shift and click on multiple pieces to move them all at once. And wrap this up by kind of making it expand past all of the distance. All right, David Flubber, you did it. Double check. And then we'll work on timing. It's a little bit slow in places, and that's okay, but we got all the points moved into the position that we want. So give you guys time to sort of wrap that up, right? So see if you can kind of start anticipating multiple pieces at once that are still in the inset of our shapes here. And then double check by going forward and backward until it encompasses the entire composition. Try out the hotkeys J and K to move forward and backwards within your timeline, one frame at a time. So it'll just jump. And again, maybe this effect is like kind of cool. David Flover, you're kind of cool. Maybe you can think of better solutions with this. And I think I can think of several where maybe making a little bit of like a wave transition might be a little bit more fun than something that's kind of this slime David Flover guy. But this is just, I think, a good process to be able to go through to understand how this animation process can be used. Is it a lot of points? Maybe. Is it too many points? Maybe. And that's okay. Okay, so let's do the next steps. If you're still working, that's okay. If you don't mind just taking a break from where you're at, go ahead and hit Command S to save, and we'll talk about the next thing that we want to do, which is working on timing. And what I'm going to have us do is actually make a copy of David Flubber to be able to better sort of animate this within the time scale. I think it's a good idea to have a copy sometimes so that that you're able to go backwards if you need to without having to hit Command Z like a million times. So with the timing with this is it's okay. I think I can speed this up and get a little bit more of a transition. So it's more of like maybe a 2-second or 3-second transition instead of what I have right now is maybe 6 seconds. So we're going to try and cut this in half by just moving the anchor points or the keyframe points around on the timeline without having to work about the anchor points, the points themselves. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy and paste David Flubber. So Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V on a PC. And I'm just going to hide the original. So I've got David Flubber and David Flubber 2. Let's rename this so it's, I don't know, his cousin Tina, maybe? Tina Flubber. So I'm going to open up the contents of this layer and go down to the path here, and we can actually edit just the keyframes. And I like the anticipation that I have in the intro, right? I want something that kind of like starts off a little bit slow to kind of add some anticipation of what the whole motion is going to be. And then I want it to sort of cascade faster. So just thinking about kind of clicking, dragging on many of these keyframes, how can I make this kind of just speed along a little bit faster? So what I've done here is I've opened up the paths. You can actually click and drag and select multiple keyframes this way. I'm going to click and drag and, oops, kind of be able to edit these a little bit more free form. And then if I hold shift and click on the one that I'm setting, I can kind of move them all together, move them closer together, move them closer together, hit shift, click on the one that I'd like to stay, and then click and drag and move them all again. So now I'm just sort of like, generally speaking, adding in a little bit less motion, and maybe we'll tighten it up here in the middle. And I can move along my timeline to sort of see what that looks like. And then maybe a little bit of lag time here, and then we'll start speeding them up again. Start getting those keyframes real close together. So again, I clicked and dragged to select all of them. I'm just now moving them, clicking and dragging, not holding anything on the keyboard when I'm clicking and dragging to move them around, and then holding down the shift key and clicking on one of them to deselect. So the shift key in this case, similar to Illustrator and Photoshop, if you want to select multiple objects, you can click and hold shift. The shift key will pick up or deselect, select or deselect multiple pieces. And there I've gotten it fit now underneath about 2 seconds of time. And I'm going to shrink my timeline here and just see how that transition looks. So shrinking my workspace timeline, then I'll hit play. Much more of like a transition, right? But I think if we were to try and do that in about that amount of time without having to sort of do that in 2 steps, that would be a little bit more difficult to do. So it looks a lot better, I think, for a transition. And now I'm ready to start animating the next thing. So I'll give you guys time to do that if you would like to make a copy and then kind of restructure your timing between your pieces as you're moving these these points on the object, these paths on the object. You can just speed it up a little bit. Give you a second to try that. Useful process. I think it helps to sort of break down the timing and the object motion into 2 different sets so that you are kind of can be more conscious of the details of what's moving and then more conscious of the details of the timing of that movement rather than trying to do it all in one go. So yeah, once you get your keyframe set up, just throw an emoji for me so I know you're ready to move on. You'll maybe play through a couple times if you're finished while you're waiting. See what you think about the timing of that. Just moved a couple of those keyframes around, so it's a little bit slower there at the end. I think I had it sped up just a little bit too fast. So it was sort of like the points were teleporting rather than sort of sliding into place. It's looking a little bit better. All right. And a good job to all of you who I didn't see who finished while I was doing that. I did not mean to not include you in that. Another thing that I think might be nice with this is if we actually shorten the time of this transition to just allow nothing on the screen for a minute. So as we're looking at this, it's starting with a circle already on the composition. And it might be nice to actually go backwards a step so that it actually appears from a much smaller spot. And this one is not terribly complicated to do. I just wanted to share the process again, going backwards in time to add a little bit more to the beginning, right? So like 0, 0, whereas it starts off with a circle on the composition as a transition sort of potentially between two different screens. This might be a useful thing to be able to know how to go backwards. So my composition is only 6 seconds. If yours is 10, that's totally fine. But go ahead and zoom out all of the way so that you can see the whole thing. I'm going to actually shorten from the back end of my composition the length of this kind of piece. And then I'm actually going to drag the whole thing over. So there's about a second of empty time at the beginning of this composition. And let me do that one more time in case you weren't quite watching it. I'm actually just going to zoom out all the way. I'm going to shrink this timeline here to maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and then just move this over to about 1 second. So now there is 0 time at the beginning where it exists, but it kind of like pops into existence here. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually move this back to about 6 seconds. So it still exists the full time of the composition, but I want to make sure that there's a little bit of nothing beforehand. And then what I'm going to do is actually select all of my keyframes and just move them over maybe 15 frames. So right now I've got nothing happening from 0 to 1, and then about doesn't quite actually starting doing any animation yet between 1 second and 1 second and 15 frames. Nice. Okay, I think that was most of you so far. So what I'm actually going to do is go ahead and add another keyframe at the beginning of my 1 second mark. So at the beginning of where I'm lining up where this whole layer exists, right? So this limitation of the layer is actually making it so that it doesn't exist for 1 second. It's just like not there until we get to the 1 second mark, and it just appears in the center. And I'm actually going to zoom in, and as you can tell, there's kind of already a shape here of the circle and all the points that we've added along the way. What I want to do here is add a keyframe. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my G tool here where my point tool is, and I'm just going to pull in, whoops, and try and select just one of these points. Doing that thing again. There we go. And I'm just going to pull those in towards the center mark. And I'm going to try and do maybe every other. And I can't totally see all the points. That's okay. We just want to kind of make it look like some of those points are coming from a central place. And if it's helpful, you're certainly welcome to just kind of follow along with me for a second. It's ended up looking like this kind of 4-leaf clover thing. Oops. Just going to pull in some of these pieces. So it kind of looks like it's just, sliding into place here. So we want it to come from somewhere. I'm just setting up an initial motion here. It looks funky. That's okay. Totally fine. What I'm going to do next is actually slide this keyframe over so that it's part of the way, and then move the rest of the points in. And again, all that's doing, it's going to start as just sort of this tiny little dot on the screen once it starts to appear, and then it will sort of slide out into the position of that circle. And there's a lot of points there, dang. This will be that time when you guys remember After Effects class and you're like, man, remember that day when we had way too many points? So just in 2 movements, I'm just clicking and dragging all these points. nothing is going to change within your animation down the timeline, right? So we're just adding something to the beginning. You can always slide these things around your timeline as we're animating these things. And as I click off of this, what should happen, I'm going to sort of click off as we're working on this, as it should just sort of appear as kind of this tiny little dot. As we're zoomed out, you may not even notice it right away. It just sort of like appears in the composition. And when I hit the play button, it's going to form itself into a circle and then do the motion that we've all added as it sort of like stretches itself out to sort of create that like transition of color in the background. Okay, do you guys think that you can do that? Any questions about that process? Do you want me to redo it?
So I'm having that problem where it like jumps back and forth because I haven't added the keyframe at the right time or something.
Okay. So like it seems like it's jumping too much or too quickly. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. I also had that issue. So I mean, it totally happens. Let me go back to my layers panel here. One thing that I did have to do, and if you need to, like here's where it's really dense for me in the keyframes, I needed to add a little bit of timing between them. It's not that you need to add keyframes. I just had to zoom in a little bit so that I can see where the keyframes are and kind of space them back out a little bit, because it will still slide between all of the frames, if that makes sense. So the more space that you add between the keyframes, the slower the motion and the more motion you'll see on the screen. So as it slides those, you can see now it's much more of a sliding motion, rather here where it just kind of jumps from two positions. So if you feel like it seems like it's just kind of like jumping rather than actually sliding around, it may be that you just need to add a little bit more space between your keyframes. And I am clicking and dragging. I'm sort of clicking and dragging from the path 1 row to get it to sort of like allow me to select multiple keyframes. If that's sort of like kind of a useful little way to select multiples. And that way you can just add about, visually, it doesn't have to be perfect amount of space between them for timing, but just sort of visually a similar amount of keyframe spacing between these. You can also, if you don't want to click and drag, you can select the keyframes that you want by clicking on the first one, hold shift, and then just click on each one that you want to move at the same time.
For me, it's like when I add keyframes in between keyframes that are already moving in between each other, it seems to kind of wig out.
Gotcha. Okay, so maybe it's something like this. So I'm going to zoom in, see if you can see my screen just for a second. When I transition, do you see how like some of these are kind of moving around? Is that kind of what you're talking about? Do you see these guys out here that are just kind of like wiggling all over the place?
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you're talking about?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah,
I don't
no
know
worries.
how to explain it.
Yeah. So if you've gone back through, and this is a sort of a little bit of a limitation within. Let me zoom closer to the screen. There's a little bit of a limitation within this process. So for instance, if you try to go back in time, right? So like I've already added in a bunch of keyframes that are like past the 4-second mark. If I go back in time to try and add in, oh, you know what? Here I'm at 3 seconds and 25 frames. If I wanted to go back and sort of make one of these start moving again, and this might be what's going on. Let me go ahead and select this TNF Lover. If I wanted to be able to move one of these and say, you know what, I want to add some anticipation here so that this one starts moving. So just watch it, just this one point as I advance. Because I've gone backwards in time and I have moved it here, but going forwards, it's going to jump to exactly the same position it was. You know what, that one's not showing it. Let me show it with this one. So like this one stays for a couple frames before it moves anywhere, right? So watch this point. And let me know if this is not what's going on your screen, but I think this might be something similar. So the two positions of just this one point within this amount of time is changing if I click and drag on this. So like I'm adding anticipation, so this one's going to start moving. But the problem is when I go back, I'm starting to go forwards in time again, I've already set it at a position by adding a keyframe here. So I actually need to go back and move it again. Does that make sense? So like it sort of is, you have to do the step-by-step process. This is kind of, like I said, it's similar to like the rotoscoping issue. If you have keyframes forward in time and you go back in time to make a change, it doesn't necessarily change the future.
Yeah, so then how am I supposed to correct that? Just manually?
Yeah. Yep. Unfortunately, just because of the limitations of being able to animate along a path, if for some reason you need to go back and add some anticipation, what I would suggest doing, and I try to do that here. If I'm going to need to go backwards, I want to add anticipation here. It's just every keyframe that I go forward with. And again, you can do the hotkeys of K and J. to be able to move forward and backwards. So here I want to anticipate. Now I need to go forward and make sure it's in about the same position so that it is kind of in the same spot. And if it's easier, use K and J to go forward and backward. Just do one point at a time all along your timeline in any positions that you want to change. And I am sorry, that is tedious and probably annoying. And I'm not trying to like add tedium or annoying to the process. I just think there's a lot of advantages of how we can animate with a single path shape. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I just, because we went back to the very beginning and we're adding in
Oh, okay.
things
So at the
to
beginning.
the very beginning, and I don't know how, I don't know.
Okay, no. Okay, so there may have been a step that I actually moved all my keyframes over when I did that. Let me zoom back out of my layers. So these keyframes that I'm adding at the beginning, and I can actually undo them and get rid of them. So let's just leave them right here, and I'll just delete these. Oops, I need that first one. So this is where we started. I just added 2 keyframes at the beginning. Normally, these, we started at 0, 0, and I did a couple things at the same time, which I apologize if that was confusing. I moved this whole layer over. Do you see how the whole layer is moving? And then I also, so I set that to sort of start at about 1 second. And what that means is that the layer doesn't exist beforehand. And then what I did is I drag selected all of these keyframes and also moved those forward so that there's now space for me to be able to add those keyframes in the beginning where nothing is happening yet. And then what I did that. Okay, and then what I did is I added a keyframe. So I'm at sort of the new starting position for this layer. And then when I go forward in time here, it looks like a circle until I start moving some of these around. So switch to my pen tool, and then I'll start, start clicking on some of these to move them closer to the centerpiece. Now it shouldn't mess up any of the positions as it moves forward in time because you're just sort of adding a keyframe beforehand. And I put quite a lot of space between those two. So it might be a spacing issue between those kind of first initial keyframes. I have mine set to about 15 frames of motion just to form the circle before it actually starts doing the motion that we originally started with. And then I'm just kind of going piece by piece from the center here, dragging those little pieces inward. Did that help fix it at all? Was it a spacing issue at the beginning?
Yeah, I guess I just haven't gotten to the part where I messed up. Maybe I just did it wrong.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, no worries. You are good. Okay, so just something like that, some goofy star pattern. And then what I did is I moved these keyframes forward. So again, I'm just adding a little bit more time to be able to then move these pieces.
Oh, okay. See, I tried to put a keyframe in there instead of moving it forward.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and again, I have maybe, I don't know, 5 frames of space between these, of like actual motion, so that you can see a little bit of that sliding motion happening. Okay, good deal.
Okay, never mind.
No, you're good. That's good. I really appreciate you asking questions like that. I think that is very helpful. I'm at a little disadvantage because I can't see your guys' screen that you're working on to try to be able to help. And again, the idea here is that it's just going to sort of come from somewhere. It doesn't exist until it then becomes a tiny dot, and then the tiny dot forms into a circle before it starts doing kind of the deform and the sort of stretch across the screen. And I may also, just to let it be a solid circle for a little bit, I can copy paste this keyframe. So I'm going to hit Command C, select that keyframe, move forward in my timeline. So it just, stays a circle for a second, or less than a second, a lot less than a second, just 5 frames before it starts advancing in the series. So again, we are trying to practice, moving things along a path, moving anchor points and handlebars to be able to manipulate that single path. We've added points to it. We are using something as kind of like a standard transition. We shorten the amount of time by going through the process of kind of being conscious of the timing. And then we're adding something to the beginning by moving those keyframes around so that we can add a little bit more visual interest within the beginning start of this. So it is a lot of kind of like moving keyframes around, adjusting the space between the keyframes, moving the layer itself around so that it doesn't exist. And these are a lot of some of the things that are kind of like practicing today. All right. All right, let me zoom back out here. And I think we're about finished with that first little animation piece.